This is Speaking of Shakespeare, a series of conversations about things Shakespearean, with a focus on new digital technologies and also about developments in Shakespeare performance and education across the globe. I'm Thomas Dabbs, recording this introduction from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. What follows is a conversation with John Yamamoto-Wilson, recently retired from Sophia University in Tokyo. We are going to discuss John's recent book on pain, pleasure, and perversity in 17th century England, and also talk a bit about his pedagogical and instructional website entitled Ano Sensei. Before we begin, I should add that this conversation is made possible with the help of institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University. This series is also funded by a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science called Kaken. And this organization, thankfully, includes support for research in the humanities. Good afternoon, John Yamamoto-Wilson. How are you? It's so good to see you and to see that you're well. And I'm almost well. I've been, we were talking before we shot about how the air in Tokyo, there's a lot of pollen in the air and it's sort of affected us.
Yeah.
And so anytime you don't feel 100% these days, you feel like, oh no, maybe, it's the big corona or something like that. But I'm not running any temperature or anything. And you're well too.
Yes, apart from, as you say, the yearly pollen, hay fever problems. Yes, I'm fine.
I wanted to start out with just mentioning your book from Ashgate. That's right, Ashgate.
It was Ashgate at the time, yes.
And now it's Routledge.
Now, yes.
Yeah, they picked it up. And look at that, what a wonderful cover. It's a little bit scary, actually. Pain, Pleasure, and Perversity, Discourses of Suffering in 17th Century England. And so the book has a lot of suffering in it, and also it's become more topical now. Tell us a little bit about it, what it goes into.
Okay, well, there is a story behind the cover. Having my interest in early modern books, I have something called Clark's Martyrology. And excuse my squeaking chair just back there when I swiveled round. You'll see it's got the same lurid illustrations. So I actually created this cover myself.
Yeah, early graphic novels, even though it's not a novel, but it kind of is, because a lot of those, I don't know much about Clark's, but there might be some fiction in there blended with other things that are historically accurate.
Yeah, he's aiming for historical accuracy. He's writing it from a Puritan kind of point of view.
Yeah.
But, I had a thing with the publisher, actually got them to put more of these lurid pictures on the inside cover as well. So I was pleased with the way it looked, and mortified to find that there was a mistake on the very first page.
Not many people will notice, but
I don't think anybody would notice, because it boils down to the fact that in the first edition of his book, the particular 17th century, not very well-known author that I was referring to, talks about Catholics going through the street in mortification in early Stuart England and mortifying themselves publicly. And then in the second edition, as I subsequently realized, he corrects himself and says, no, they didn't actually go through they went to somebody's house, they went to a private place and they mortified themselves there. So he backtracked on what he'd written in the first edition. But obviously, I think it's pretty much the sort of thing that would happen, that hearing that the Catholics had gone barefoot through the streets, on that, the assumption would be that they'd mortified themselves as they were going through the streets. He corrects himself and tells us that, which surprised me, that would have happened in England at that time. But no, they'd gone to a private house, as he subsequently corrects himself in the second edition.
So this is part of, well, I guess maybe the origin is Fox.
Clark does take quite a lot of his stuff from Fox, and
these are hagiographies. These are Protestant Protestant efforts to replace the canon of saints in the Roman Church with a new canon.
Something like that, yes. Obviously, you know, it's difficult with it when it comes to the early Christians. There's not going to be a particular, there's the man himself. There's not going to be a particular, obviously a distinction except when he goes into kind of things like the Waldensians or something like that. There's not a particular distinction between early Christian martyrs of, well, there weren't any denominations as such from that point of view. I mean, if you're looking at what Romans were doing to Christians or something like that, which he talks about in the beginning, there are Catholic martyrologies as well, of course, and
well, in your book you talk a lot about the converse, the torturing and the suffering of people who remained loyal to the Roman Church during that period, and generally about suffering.
Right. Well, I mean, what actually sparked it off was the initial research that I did in Cambridge on translations from Catholic and Catholic editions appearing in Protestant England in the early modern period. One of the things that emerged was that obviously you've got, you know, doctrinal differences, but there's a whole different attitude towards suffering, which hadn't really, I think, been dragged out into the open and examined under the microscope. And when I was fortunate enough to get a sabbatical, which I did about 6 or 7 years before I retired, I spent it in the UL, in the University Library at Cambridge, developing that topic. And it was fascinating. I had a very happy year cycling down to the library through rain, wind, sleet or snow on a daily basis. I was a very familiar figure there. And,
beautiful English weather.
Oh, tell me about it.
Well, that's right. You did your work at Cambridge, and your career as an educator and scholar was at Sophia University. And for our listeners who may not know, Sophia University is a Jesuit. It is part of the Catholic Church, but it's a Jesuit university. In our other conversations, I don't think, you're not a practicing Catholic, are you?
I'm not a Catholic at all. No, I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a Protestant. I'm not anything.
Yeah.
My mother was a fairly devout Catholic in my early childhood. And then as it was coming up to I was the eldest son, as it was coming up to my first communion, she got cold feet about the whole thing.
Huh.
Yeah. Again, suffering. She felt that people should not be brought up. It wasn't the way to be bringing up children, to be afraid of hellfire and always being threatened with being, you know, burned in hell for eternity. She couldn't really buy it. And my father was one of those, you know, twice a year Anglicans, go to the church at Easter and Christmas, and who, as you know, an academic intellectual himself, would raise all kinds of issues with my mother, which were quite interesting debates on country walks about how there'd been two popes fighting each other. So how could they possibly, you know, claim authority, you know, to have a sort of, authority, that sort of issue. So I kind of grew up with an interest in those sorts of things, but I never, was personally, unlike say Father Milward at Sophia. We're talking about Sophia University here in Tokyo, of course, just in case people are not sure, people are thinking of somewhere else.
Yes, I should have made that clear. Well, we were going to do Peter Milward a little bit later, perhaps, but we can go ahead now. Let's talk about
Peter Milward.
The Sophia University in Tokyo, and Peter Milward.
Yes, he retired from the department just as I joined it. So I had been at Sophia for 3 years in a language section where I'd been brought in with, I think the idea was give him a couple of literature classes and see how he gets on. We know we've got a post coming up in a couple of years' time. Let's see if he's suited for it. So that's what they did. They had me teaching languages. I had a background in linguistics as well as in literature, so I covered all their bases. And then I moved into the English literature department just as he was retiring from it. But of course, as a Jesuit, he lived on the campus. And not only that, but in those days, there was a Renaissance Institute and a Renaissance Center. The Renaissance Center was a physical room inside the university library, and the Institute held yearly conferences and lecture courses from time to time and that sort of. Both of them have gone now. They don't exist anymore. But at that time, I had quite a lot of interaction with him because, you know, we had a shared interest in all of that. And so I suppose that's something that brought me into thinking about Shakespeare from a more academic point of view, his insistence that Shakespeare must have been Catholic.
Yes.
I don't personally buy it. I mean, obviously he wasn't a papist. I mean, in the overt sense, it's possible that he was what they called a church, what they're now calling a church papist. That term has gained some circulation. Someone who kept quiet about it, basically was a Catholic, but shut up and went to church just to keep the peace and not get himself into trouble. And of course, there are things like Empson from my old college at Magdalen, Empson, the critic. He was, I think, the first person to pick out what Shakespeare was talking about when he talks about those ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. And he is, of course, undoubtedly talking about the dissolution of the monasteries. He was earlier than my day, obviously.
Yeah, but his spirit is still there. He's still there in spirit, very much.
And he's right. I mean, there's no question about it. Shakespeare is, you know, ostensibly regretting the passing of the passing of the monasteries, the closure of the monasteries, those ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. Yeah. But I think Father Milward assumes a commitment, or feels there's a commitment where we don't necessarily have to see such a commitment. Poets engage, they engage the feelings, they engage the emotions. And then, of course, if you take him out of context, you can, which I'm sorry to say, but I felt Father Milward frequently did. It would be things like, I must hold my tongue. He's talking about the fact that he has to shut up, he has to stop complaining openly about the death of his father, because it could be politically dangerous for him to show his dissatisfaction and discontent at what seems to be going on. He needs to play it safe. And
this is Shakespeare, not Milward. This is Shakespeare.
This is Shakespeare. Yeah. But Milward takes it out of context, and has published several times. He's used that particular quote as saying that he's trying to say that, you know, he believes in Catholicism, but in context he's not saying that anything even remotely of the sort. And those were the kinds of always very agreeable discussions that Peter Milward and I would have in the Renaissance Center, or later on in the Jesuit Center, S.J. House, about that kind of thing.
What a wonderful opportunity to be able to discuss these things as part of your participation in the academic community, and to have a scholar. He's quite. I'm not sure if he's still alive.
No, he died a few years ago. Yeah, but the question of his death, there's an interesting story where he appeared at a conference a few years ago, before he died, obviously. And I don't know who was giving the presentation, started saying, but of course, all of these ideas of Peter Milward and blah, 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 and people like that. And he stood up and said, I am Peter Milward. And the man's jaw hitting the ground. I heard this from Joseph O'Leary, the man's jaw hitting the ground because I thought you died years ago. Well, he did. He lived a very long life and a very active life.
Yeah.
Right up until the end, he was writing, publishing.
And he amassed quite a collection that I'm not sure if that's still held by Sophia, or I heard that it was acquired by Harvard, and I'm not sure. Yeah, so I heard that from another source. It might be completely.
The last I heard, the Peter Milward collection was the only named separate collection inside Sophia Library. And it was a wonderful collection of books on the Renaissance and the Reformation period that had been previously in the Renaissance Centre. And like other centres, they'd been a medieval centre, which was actually even more systematic and wonderful. And these were all assimilated into the main library. This one was not assimilated in the sense that it wasn't mixed in with other books on various shelves. It got its own kind of bookcase of its own. And this was the Peter Milward collection. And the last I heard, it was still there.
So theoretically, if someone gains permission, they could have access to that collection for research.
Yes, but he never collected books in the, I mean, he didn't collect, it's not a collection of early modern books, let's be clear about it. It's a collection of writings on the Reformation from Daubigny, you know, sort of 18th, 19th, well, Daubigny 19th century, but possibly some of the early ones might have been late 18th. And fairly systematic in that sense. He had pretty much, if it was on the Reformation, especially on the Catholic side of the Reformation, he probably had it. He had all of the recusant, you know, the reprint recusant publications. So to that extent, he had a large amount of recusant literature in reprint editions.
Yeah. Well, so it probably, if you have access to, say, the Bodleian or the UL at Cambridge, or one of the large research libraries in the States, you might be able to find these editions. However, within Japan, I think it might be very difficult to find many of the things he collected around in other universities, particularly all gathered in one place like that.
Yeah.
Well, you are a antiquarian, a collector of books, as you just showed us with Clark's, and there's quite a lot we have been doing at my university. We've been working with the Folger Library to digitize our small but very good special collections of with a focus on Bibles, mostly in Latin. But from we have in Cunabula, we have you know, one of the post Gutenberg versions of the Jerome Bible that we finished, and it's on display at the Folger. And I know that you have been busy digitizing your own collection. And how is that going?
I invested in this scanner, which you see sitting over there.
Yeah,
it's a lovely, elegant little piece of work. And I just this morning was scanning something called the Gunpowder Treason.
Well, Guy Hawkes. What am I talking about? Guy Hawkes. And I was thinking of another writer, actually, but John Donne has, of course, his famous sermon that followed that has been digitized and dramatized as it could have happened from the pulpit at Paul's Cross at St. Paul's Cathedral, the outdoor preaching pulpit. So I'm greatly interested in that. Gunpowder Plot has developed a history of its own that still is out there, of course, very a celebrated kind of semi-holiday or to this day.
Remember the 5th of November. Yes. Which Shakespeare would have known all about. I mean, he'd have lived through all of that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. and this desire to blow up things, which before Guy Fawkes, probably 50 years before, I think Somerset in the Protectorate, between Henry and Mary, at roughly the end of the 1540s, there was some blowing up of the Office of Revels. He blew up a section of it. I don't know why. And I think there was an explosion. They took down some buildings in St. Paul's, but I'm not sure. I know that they destroyed buildings, and how much by gunpowder, I'm not sure. It's a quick and easy way. They wanted to preserve the stones to use them in Somerset's case for Somerset Palace. Guy Fawkes had some more kind of apocalyptic visions of what he wanted to accomplish. just blow it all up. And I think, John, you know more than I do. I think he came darn close to succeeding in that effort.
Well, there is also the issue of whether there were actually agents provocateurs in there, stymieing it from the beginning. And of course, there was the letter of one of the conspirators to a family member who was a politician, which is what gave the game away, saying, stay away from Parliament on that particular night. So after that, of course, there was no chance.
Yeah. So they were forewarned.
But it is amazing that they could actually rent cellars directly under the Houses of Parliament. They could actually do that.
Well, this recent attack on the U.S. Capitol, I think the same sort of thing, that nobody expected that to happen from that particular group of people. It was, even though there were threats, there were, in hindsight, it was abundantly clear that something bad could happen. I think it just took them by surprise. No one would do that. No one would go down to the cellars and load them up with gunpowder. No one's going to charge and try to take over the Capitol building. I mean, my goodness, with all of but there it is.
There it is. There it is. Yeah.
So I wish that I could have helped you with the scanning part of that, but we're just not allowed to even enter that building now. I'm not allowed. But I think it's better that you got your own scanner and learned to use it.
Very happy customer. I think for consumer satisfaction, forget that hair dryer that you might have been sort of promising yourself, or forget any that little moped that you thought might get you to work a bit quick. Get a scanner. Wonderful things. It's so satisfying.
Life is better with the scanner.
Life is better.
And you have a very fine one there, and
not that expensive.
Yeah, and so you can create PDFs, and those. Did you tell me they're searchable?
They're text searchable PDFs. Yes.
Wow.
I mean, being in early modern English, people would have to understand that for example, letters U and V and F and S. If you want to search for pleasure, spell it with an F instead of an S in the middle, and then it'll come up.
Yeah, as the technology becomes more intelligent, getting better for machine reading. Of course, you were on with me. We worked together with Angela Davenport and other people to bring EEBO, early English books, online to Japan. And we're finally victorious in the sense that this gained momentum. And I know that with your book that you relied on EEBO quite a bit to find. Yes. And it's not perfect, but it's good enough, for a lot of things.
Yeah.
And there's nothing like it before.
No.
I'm going to try to talk to David McInnis at University of Melbourne maybe next month, and he works with lost plays. But he wrote a quick little article, I think, and I mentioned it in another podcast about, I think it was for a university publication, about how the term wild goose chase is attributed to Shakespeare by the OED, as are many things. With a quick OED search, EEBO search, you find that was a fairly common phrase. It's very apparent, and that it went kind of viral, that article. And he really wasn't expecting it. And of course, I brought that up with our mutual friend, Pip Wilcox, who's now with the National Archives. She was very politely said, well, I have friends who are working with the OED, and I believe you me, they have adjusted. And the revisions have been made, to be a little bit less Shakespeare centric.
Well, yes.
A lot less, actually. And so there's a lot more there. But it's really not a mistake on the part of the OED. Those were the books that they had, and
so much of that literature of the period had fallen into obscurity, which is why I found it so useful, because I was able to say, okay, let's look at particular search terms and then see what they're actually saying in texts that are not quite so well known, and find out what is being systematically said, or what kinds of things are cropping up again and again. So obviously it would be very misleading, and I think there are problems with people trying to use that kind of database to get statistical data. So I think that you have to be very careful about how you interpret statistics, but at the same time, to locate references, it's a godsend. I mean, we didn't have anything like that until this came along.
Yeah, you can certainly track consciousness, if not hardcore empirical statistics. You can certainly track consciousness, and you can certainly track, in my what thrills me, and I'm sure you too, is that you can see the creative process, not just in Shakespeare, but in other writers, not in what they make up out of the air, how they use materials that were already available and had some kind of shared knowledge in public, the reading public, and how they use those materials and integrated them for then what is in fact a very original work in many of their cases. It jumps to mind, Midsummer Night's Dream jumps to mind. It's so referential of so many things, and you can't point to exactly one thing like you can say with the Henry plays and Holinshed, but the way it's blended, and the I don't want to call it a curry, but that mixture is just it shows the actual nature of the brilliance, if you're looking for brilliance in Shakespeare. That's and many other examples. And so now we can see it a lot better, if not perfectly.
Writing the monograph, there's so much overtly said and specifically said during the period about the Protestant scorn for Catholic miracles. And there's, even in books which have got some very, very sort of shocking aspects of self-inflicted suffering, or penances, as the Catholics would call them, the Protestant response doesn't really mention that very much. So there's so much that you have to infer. And what you find is that you can infer it through the fact that, well, when they're translating it, they gloss over certain details, or so if they're translating it for a Protestant readership, it won't just be purely doctrinal alterations that are made. In some cases, Catholic works of devotion get rehashed into works of Protestant fiction, effectively. It's more fictionalized, because there's no place in Protestant religious discourse for that kind of scenario.
But there's also pleasure, and so talk about pleasure and how that fits with pain. And
well, really, what you're looking at is at the beginning of the 17th century. It's all about suffering, really, because you've got this Protestant doctrine of justification by faith. Now, you may say, well, John, you're going off on a different tangent here, but it's not really, because in order to know that you were saved, and how would you know? And you had to have this faith that God would not let you rot in hell. God would have saved you. God would have written your name in the book of life from the beginning. But how would you know that? Really the only ideas that they had about that was that you would be a person who would rejoice to suffer for Jesus Christ. this would be, I mean, if you were just suffering but not rejoicing, well, that would be just a foretaste of the hell that's to come. If you were living a life of pleasure, well, hey, you were doomed. You know, when you died, all that pleasure would be paid for. You're going to go to hell. The only way to be sure that you were one of the saved was to be a person who rejoiced to suffer. Now, quite a lot of attention has been given to this in recent research, the depression that accompanied this. And I mean, Shakespeare himself, you know, in Hamlet, you've got a lot of that sort of thing, you know, how weary, flat, stale, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world, and so on. If you weren't suffering, and rejoicing to suffer, you were probably going to go to hell. And it's no accident the books like The Anatomy of Melancholy and really the first books that are sort of studying introspection and depression. I mean, we wouldn't call it melancholy now, but it's the same thing, really. And by the end of the century, people just aren't thinking like that anymore. I mean, there are a few. I mean, Bunyan is later on in the century, and he's one of the Puritan few, really, who takes all of this very seriously. He grace abounding to the chief of sinners. He believes that he is doomed, and at every turn he thinks, but this doubt arises in his mind, and this doubt arises in his mind, and then he gets arrested and he gets put in prison, and he thinks, thank God I have been chosen to suffer for my Lord. And I know and I may not be presenting it very sympathetically. I mean, the guy actually seriously, and that's how he saw it. He saw it in those terms.
So there's
yeah.
pleasure in pain.
Well,
and
that
pain
is
and pleasure, I guess.
You've also got the more, all through the 17th century, you've got a huge amount of reworking of Stoicism and Epicureanism, with Stoicism winning out pretty heavily in the earlier part of the century, and Epicureanism kind of coming in for the last few laps there. But by the end of the 17th century, you're starting to have ideas like human rights. That's when cruel and unusual punishment is used for the first time, in a very ironic, if you look at it, context. The idea that you should not, there are certain types of suffering that no one should have to go through, no one should have to endure. And that's really the beginning of the end of things like hanging, you know, being hanged, drawn, and quartered, or the terrible ways in which people were mutilated before they were actually put to death, and this sort of thing by the state. Yeah, by the end of the century, you've got much more of it's much more a world of coffee houses. It's a much more urbane world. The coffee house is frankly beginning to replace the church as the center of many people's lives.
Yeah.
And you've got this move away from a rather dour way of looking at things, which, all right, not everybody was dour, as Shakespeare said, because thou art virtuous, shall there be no more cakes and ale. You know, there were plenty of people who were out to have fun in those days as well, in the Elizabethan period and the early Stuart period. But by the end of the century, it's become much more normative. So that's the other thing that the book traces. They kind of shift from, well, you've got to suffer, and you've got to rejoice to suffer, to, well, actually that's starting to sound a bit perverse by the end of the 17th century in Protestant discourse. Yeah. Which is the third aspect of the title, Pain, Pleasure, and Perversity.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that distinction, because really the era that you're talking about toward the end is what Habermas talks about in terms of the public sphere and the coffee house culture that came in toward the end of the 17th century and remained, you know, for a long time, and maybe even still be with us. And I know scholars who, I think not incorrectly, but they try to take that and plug it into the 16th and early 17th century and talk about public sphere research. And there were public spheres, but it's quite different from the one that Habermas was describing and described by so many writers. But there were public spaces that I think at Paul's Cross and of course in the theater that of course you might see some of the seeds of that sort of thing, maybe. But I'm glad you made that distinction. Perversity. Now, where does perversity fit into the sort of trinity?
That's really where, as I say, certain religious texts start to be translated in a more sort of fictionalized way. Rico's translation of Gracian, you've got a Spanish Jesuit writing about, it's an allegory, okay? But it's not one that has any place, as I say, in Protestant religious discourse, where the temptations of the world are represented by really kind of proto-dominatrices. That's basically what they are, and they inveigle people by chains of their own making into the inn of the world. The inn, as in hotel, where they spend many, many years being, basically sort of having suffering inflicted on them by these temptresses or whatever you call them, and then they're thrown out of the windows. And it's very interesting how the translation kind of pumps up the more salacious, or the more kind of, makes it more erotic. The Catholic version is very simple and bare bones, and very kind of, it's quite extreme to read it, but it's still fairly simple and bare bones, whereas the Protestant version kind of jazzes it up. You can see he's playing it for those erotic effects. And it's not in a religious text. He's taken it out of a religious context. He's made it something much more kind of secular. And there are quite a lot of texts like this where you can see that the Protestant treatment of those texts is very different from the Catholic treatment, because it's just too much. It's just too much.
It had to be, I don't want to say censored, but maybe toned down a bit, dialed down a bit to fit probably kind of a growing middle class taste of people who, you know, a new class of reader coming into this who really could not handle some of the graphic. What you're talking about reminds me of
it's not so much that they couldn't handle it. I think there was a tremendous interest in that you do get some very, very harsh writings about suffering by people like Nash, for example, was very good at writing about that. You've got quite a few writers who are very good at describing really gory and gruesome things. I mean, our friend Shakespeare was pretty good at it when he turned a mind to it. You know?
Some of his Jacobean contemporaries, I'm thinking John Webster and the Dutch Coffee, and and on the stage, you know, and people clamored. I'm certain clamored for tickets to watch the spectacle of that perverse suffering that is inflicted upon someone who's really an innocent, as you would,
so the spectacle of suffering, you've got some interesting works coming out by women at this time. You've got Mary Roth, you've got Afra Ben, and they're writing it in a very kind of close to the bone kind of way about all of this kind of stuff. No, what's interesting is that it cannot really be incorporated into a religious context anymore. Or you've got this early account of an early Christian who's being taken into Rome, taken into a beautiful garden, tied down to a bed, and mounted by a prostitute. And as she bends down to kiss him, he bites off his tongue and spits it in her face. Now, the Catholic translations of this Latin text sorry, I tapped my fingers on the table. The Catholic translations of this Latin text put it into the vernacular more or less verbatim. All of the Protestant editions all across Europe, not just in England, but all across Europe, expurgate it hugely. They just really cannot find a way to tell this story as a religious text. They expurgate it. They cut out many of the details, most of the details, and just give a very, very, sometimes they don't even explain very clearly the visual situation. It clearly made them uncomfortable.
It sort of Baudelarized it long before Thomas Baudelaire came around.
Yeah.
A bit, yeah.
I mean, the Latin text would be there and would be, and it's interesting that the first pornographic works that appeared were also written in Latin.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's an idea that, like, we can't let the plebs get hold of this. It's all right for us, but we can't let the plebs get hold of this stuff. It just wouldn't be right.
And the Latin language dislocates it a bit because it's not the vernacular.
Yeah, but still, it's pretty close to the bone. A lot of that. In fact, well, using the word bone there,
Yeah.
with a bit of a double entendre. That word, do you know that double entendre doesn't exist in French? A double sense. We say it in English, but French people have been outraged when I've said that. We don't say that.
I didn't know that. I thought I was sounding kind of sophisticated when I talked about that and tried to pronounce it somewhere close to.
It's not French.
What the French would pronounce it. Well, that's good. Well, that goes up on the list with French fries. Neither are they French either. Well, this is something I could talk with you for hours on, but I think our listeners have a good idea of the type of approach that you take in terms of your research in the early modern period and your book and onward. But I want to focus on your work now. You are retired, but you really aren't, because I'm looking on YouTube here, and you run a site called Ano Sensei.
Yeah.
Which, for people who are not involved with Japanese culture, that would be a student asking you politely to explain something. They start out with Ano Sensei, and there's some humor in the title of the site. Ano being a kind of transitional word.
Well, I kind of see it as a bit like kind of, hey, teacher,
Yeah.
And the early videos I had, the student going, Ano Sensei, and me going, Ano Nani, like, so what? Yeah, go on, what?
Yeah, go on, what? Yeah. So that has turned into I think you've been doing this now for what, 3
years now.
3 years, and for a total of quite a few videos here. I saw it posted here. I'm at your site, and the thing is, you're doing language, literature, history, and that's what you do. And in language, you go into, I think, with some wonderful specifics with graphs and so forth that would rival a beat, I think, most textbooks out there in terms of explication of something as simple as the pronunciation of L and R, how to do that a bit better, right? And transitional grammar. I'm not transitional. But
transformational grammar.
Transformational grammar, and very, very sophisticated, I think, looks that speak toward very practical pedagogy, right? And practical understanding of how to improve your English today, at least this small part, right? Mm-hmm. And you've gotten wonderful reception there. And you have a separate grammar and pronunciation. Those are split out as different categories.
Right.
And they are of varying degrees of popularity and the wasei ego, the kind of strange way the English is appropriated into the language, which I think I've seen a couple of those that are very funny. And what surprised me about this site is you would think that your audience, once you're out there, would be more drawn to the practical English. And in our teaching careers, there's been a strong force out there that we always sort of push back against a bit, because they would like to strip off all the varnish off the wood, and just say, like business English, just teach them words they'll have to use in the hotel business. And you go, they might have to use a lot of words in the hotel business. It's the English language, the English for specific purposes and that sort of thing. And there's some value to paring it down and looking at things very specifically. And you would think that's where the student, particularly student interest, and also many adults in Japan who are striving to improve their English, you think that that's where they would be drawn to, kind of how to side. And you've done a series of poetry videos that are just killing it.
They are exponentially more popular. Yes.
Thousands of views, tens of thousands of views.
Yes.
Are sort of a tsunami over the practical English side, which is doing very well. But I can't. John Keats' "Ode to a Nightingale," I think is your #1 right now.
Yeah.
With 33,000 views.
Yeah.
My goodness. And then next, Shelley's "Ode to the West Wind." Now, if I had to pick my top 5 British poems, those two would be in the top 5 for certain. But I didn't know how many other people out there, were interested in watching a 15-minute video or so. And your Gerard Manley Hopkins, which he is not quite as well known, as ubiquitous as the other two.
Yeah.
Those in the biz know him.
Yeah.
That's done extremely well.
Yeah.
And your "Ode on a Grecian Urn" is picking up. So, it's a bit of a...
Not there quite so long, but it's getting...
Yeah. And you just did Milton's Lycidas, which I thought was just wonderful. It reminded me of "Look Homeward, Angel." That's the source for the title of a book by a Southern writer in the early 20th century, Thomas Wolfe, who was very, very celebrated in my educational training in kind of liberal arts, but Southern environment. He was very much reified as one of the greats there with Faulkner and others. And maybe it's fallen off a bit, but he pulled it straight from Lycidas, which, this ambiguous poem. But the way that you present these with graphics and explanations and nice visuals is alluring. It engages people. And I would be delighted to try to break down who these thousands of people are. Are they students in high school? Are they retired folks who just want to learn more about Keats? Who do you?
Okay, I can explain about the demographics of that channel. They are mostly young. Nearly all are under the age of 35, and well over half are under the age of 25. There's a preponderance of female viewers, although that seems to be balancing itself out a little bit more these days. And India and Italy are the two main viewing countries. I can see, both of those in a way. I can see that they have a strong interest in the culture and in the poetry of the culture. So I'm not entirely surprised, but also I have been using translated captions, translated subtitles, so that people, especially language like Italian, Arabic, a lot of viewers, or a fair number of viewers, are coming in and watching with Arabic subtitles. And the comments that I'm getting are very often from, that kind of background, rather than, say, the United States or Britain or Japan, although I occasionally get comments from those kinds of backgrounds as well.
May I ask, do you do the auto-generated, like if you're doing Arabic, do you just auto-generate the Arabic?
I do, and I am aware, especially because I do Spanish and other languages that I do speak, and I'm aware that the AI gets it wrong sometimes.
Yeah.
And where I spot an egregious mistake, I go in and manually correct it. But it's too much to try and correct everything. But I think just having it there gives enough comprehensibility to what otherwise might be rather challenging to make it worthwhile for those people who choose to view it with subtitles, which international subtitles, I think now in languages other than English, are probably accounting for some 20% of all people who do use subtitles.
Yeah. Well, as you know, we're trying to get our some, if not all, of our conversations in this series translated into Japanese, because we're doing it from Tokyo. We're doing it with a grant from the Japanese government, from institutional support from my university, and it's just as a courtesy, you know, because most of the people in Japan who would be interested in this would be able to manage well over 90% with the help of English subtitles, right?
Right.
And some absolutely perfectly, you know, in a native fashion. But some younger people, students, might feel more comfortable having the help of what they call jimaku. But it is I didn't know it's going to be, it's been a challenge. It's been a bit of it just in terms of time. And when you have a couple of young people, as I do on this project, working on that, time is money. We have to pay these young people, of course, for their effort. And so I don't know, it might come down to, it might be too forbidding to do everything. And also you have to wait for a while for the Japanese subtitles to get out. But I think we're going to certainly do several key ones, and particularly our Japanese scholars, Japanese nationals. And I need to mention at this point that you are on the menu here because of all the things you've done, but you also have joined us as a foreign national who has taught in Japan for many years. That's a genre of scholar in our world, right? Because I'm in the same business. So along with interviewing Japanese scholars, I want to make sure that we include the unique experiences of people who have moved here and are immigrants, so to speak, and adapting to the Japanese system, which sometimes is wonderful and sometimes isn't so wonderful. And but it's good to hear your voice on that.
I think you'll find that the subtitles, Tom, are going to be very well received. If one goes to a Shakespeare performance here in Japan, it's likely to either be in Japanese, but they'll put up English subtitles, or it'll be in English and they'll put up Japanese subtitles. And this is true for a lot of productions here in Japan. They're used to the idea of having things, live theater performances with subtitles. So I think that really would make a difference to the way the videos were received here in Japan. Yeah.
Or in London, if you go to an opera, or in New York, or somewhere, if you go to an opera and they have the subtitles out there, it makes the whole thing a whole lot better. People get jokes and whatever, the magic flute or whatnot, because Mozart had this wonderful sense of humor along with the music that fits with it that you don't pick up if you're not really, you have to be a native speaker of Italian mostly. But I think it will add richness, and I think the AIs will get better and better, of course. They already have.
They are getting that, yes. Yeah, they are getting
they're growing up fast. They're like a child who suddenly you walk in and they're 2 or 3 years older after a month. So,
but you realize there are hurdles that AI can probably never really fully overcome.
No. For instance, the way your name, Yamamoto-Wilson, you'd have to teach the AI to pick up the Japanese name and the English name within an English context or within a Japanese context. Which, how do you tell the machine, what do you do on the Japanese side? Do you put this in katakana? or do you have kanji and then Wilson in katakana?
Yeah.
Right? Or do you just go, we're going to go Romaji on this because we're that smart? And
you see, a Japanese person would instantly just look at the situation and say, oh, well, he's Western. He's clearly not Japanese. The assumption would be that he was not born in Japan, and that he's therefore he's a foreigner, and therefore his name should be in kana.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, that would be.
Or they would put,
but how would AI come to that conclusion? How would AI have any idea about how to make those kinds of assumptions?
Oh yeah, and millions of examples. Really, when we begin to think about it, millions. But if you get over 90%, you've gone a long, long, long way.
Yeah.
And if the rest of it isn't just ridiculous. I tried to watch a movie, an old American movie. You may know it, Cool Hand Luke, which is one of my favorites. It's a prison movie, but it's about redemption and it's about sacrifice and it has all those themes, and it's extraordinarily humorous and played through with these character actors who have these wonderful idioms, you know, the Southern idioms, and the AI was trying to translate it. They didn't have subtitles in Japanese that were actually done professionally.
Right.
And, you know, where are you going, boy? What do you think you're doing around here? That, absolutely no idea what this guy was saying. The Southern prison kind of warden or boss, they called him, you know.
Yeah.
They would translate boss as shacho, but your boss on a work crew in a prison farm, of course, that's a whole different meaning. Mm-hmm. And we made it about 5 minutes. She said, I don't understand anything that's going on here. and it's such a shame, but eventually I hope there'll be resources to do both. You know, you bring your AI in and then you have someone else come in, clean it up.
Yeah. And I have actually done Japanese and Spanish, and yes, I've done a Japanese version of one video. I've done a Spanish and Italian video of a couple of others.
Yeah. Well, of course, the Romance languages are a little bit closer, actually a huge amount, a lot closer. What I want to do here, though, is to segue a little bit into, I wanted to comment, and probably too far into the program to have been completely polite to you, but to comment to our viewers that you were an enormous help when I was trying to set up this series. I had a grant and no way to spend the money. And I thought, well, maybe we can do a series of interviews, but I really don't know where to start. And so I had to start from scratch, you know, through learning how to record, try to get some sound quality, and you were extraordinarily helpful. And I hope you continue to be. I'm going to try to encourage you in every way, because you were ahead of me on this. You have been doing this, and I've been involved with some other, well, teaching. I still have to teach, and I'm trying to get a couple of articles written and that sort of thing. But this pandemic forced me into at least doing that, and you helped me along.
Right. I love teaching, obviously, and that's why I wouldn't be making those Ano Sensei videos if I didn't love teaching. It's obvious that we talked about academic stuff in the first half of this interview, and then we talked about this much more pedagogically oriented stuff, these videos. And that's, to me, it's a very, very important side of things. To the extent that I might write one or two more academic papers before I hang up my, what do you hang up? Your hat? Your boots. Before I pop my clogs in the English idiom.
I like that one.
Yeah, the popping would be to pawn, you know, to take to the pawn shop, you know, to EEBO pawn shop, you know.
Yeah. How does the AI translate that into Japanese?
Goodness knows, but I don't think they have the concept of such shops here. But the last thing you would get rid of would be your clogs.
Yeah, yeah.
Only if you knew you were going to die would you finally pop your clogs.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Well, John, let's don't die yet. I want to talk a little bit more about your youth and what led you to Japan and led you into led you into humanities, studies in the humanities and language and that sort of thing. And I think you told me you went to a regular old school in the south of England, where you were born and grew up. You didn't go to Eton, I don't think,
No.
and you were qualifying for university, and there was a little bit of a, I guess it's another Brit term. It was a little bit of a cock up in there. Something didn't quite go right, or the timing was a little off.
No, it was fairly straightforward. I mean, my parents moved around quite a bit. My father was an academic. Okay, he was a university teacher, so that's also explains a fair bit of how I ended up as I am. So we moved around a bit as he was going up his career ladder, and my last couple of years of schooling were sort of what we call sixth form. The last 2 years of what you now call what you call high school in America, and English, and what the British are now starting also to call high school. And we had these tests called A levels, and you had to get a certain number of A levels in order to be able to go to university. But you would apply to the university, or to a series of universities, before taking the A level exams. And then I and several others that year got better than expected results, and along with worse than expected offers before taking the exams, before taking the A levels. So the headmaster said, look, you people, you've got good results and you don't have offers that really match those results. Why don't you stay on for an extra term and do Cambridge and Oxford entry? So we did, several of us, a number of us did.
Yeah.
And
so there was nothing messed up about that. It was just that.
Well, if you'd been going to one of the elite schools like Eton, you'd have done your Oxbridge before doing your A levels.
So it's
because this was just a regular, county grammar school. They weren't in gear for that kind of thing, so we just stayed on for an extra term afterwards.
So you have the ability, though, at that point to retreat for a period and then come back in and get things in the right order.
The way it worked out was that we got those exam results in the summer for the A levels. We stayed on until Christmas, and just before Christmas, we took the Cambridge and Oxford entry exams.
Yes.
But of course, we were then being accepted for the following autumn.
Yes. Okay, so you had to fill in that time, and I think that's when you ended up somehow in Barcelona.
Yes, I was very lucky to get a teaching job, a nice teaching job, working at a school for students from the regular main school were coming in for an English class after the main classes had finished. So from 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock every evening, for 4 hours a day, I was teaching English conversation, and I had my days free up until that time. I had my weekends free. So I had a wonderful time.
Plenty of money, not overflowing with it, but plenty to get by.
Well, things were so cheap, Tom.
I know. They still are in some places. You learned a language. You learned the language in that period, or
yes, I had already taken Spanish as a school subject, so I spoke some Spanish, but not very well. And then I found that I had an affinity for it.
Yeah.
And yes, so I had a great time there. And then after graduating from Cambridge, I had a total sense of anticlimax because I had not thought in the slightest about what I would do afterwards. And I just had not thought at all about what I would do when I graduated.
But you had chosen to go the path where you were an English major. Would you call it that? Yeah. And
English meaning, of course, English literature.
English literature.
And very English. I mean, you might look at the odd Scot or the odd Welsh, but scarcely even at the Irish.
Oh, okay. We're staying, yes, in England. Yes.
English literature was very geographically determined. We didn't look at colonial literature, post-colonial literature, or anything like that.
Yeah, straight up Tennyson.
I think things would have changed by now. Obviously, I don't suppose it would be the same kind of thing now, but
I'm sure
it was very English.
Yeah,
And,
not any what picks from the Pict tradition in the north, in the Scottish north, or the Brethren tradition over in Wales. Had to be
nothing.
Anglo-Saxon conquered by the Norsemen. Combination of those. I'm being facetious. I'm actually referencing one of the videos.
We started really with, like, you know, Langland and the Pearl Poet and Chaucer, and we just went through at a kind of rate of a major author or major kind of topic a week, until we got up to the present day. But we didn't really look outside what was English literature. I went back to Spain for a few months. But this time it wasn't such a good job, and I wasn't so happy with the whole thing. So I came back to England thinking, well, this is it. I'm going to start on postgraduate studies, which I did again at Cambridge. And within a year or so, my supervisor had died. This is any of you out there who are contemplating doing a PhD. It's not on the list of most people's priorities, but do please make sure that your supervisor is in good health and is likely to last for at least the next 5 years, let's say.
Yeah, break into his or her house and remove all the unhealthy food from the refrigerator and make sure if there's any tobacco around to remove that. And there was
something wrong with his ear, and he had some sort of infection, and I spoke to him on the phone. He said he wasn't going to be able to take the class, to supervise me. And I said, well, take care of yourself and get well soon. And he said, well, I certainly don't intend to die of it. And that was the last I ever heard of him.
And he did.
He did die of it.
I have a great uncle, one step up, who was at Columbia and had finished his dissertation, and his advisor died. And they put in the next guy, and the next guy said, I don't think I'm going to be able to. And it had already been approved by the guy who did die. And so he said, you're just going to have to do some more work here. And I think my uncle said, I know more about this than you do, and I'm leaving. I don't have the time to do this.
Yeah.
And I don't think in the current environment, it would be quite that bad. I think someone who stepped in would be more inclined to,
the person who stepped in for me was, he wasn't bad. He just wasn't really a specialist in that particular area. So I was working on the Spanish literature as it was translated into England during the early modern period.
Yeah.
Also, the English department at that time, I think, well, all hell broke loose. Now, which famous novelist, David Lodge, talks about all hell breaking loose in the English department at Cambridge. Yes. One young lecturer losing his job, and the whole thing going kind of, all because of like Marxist approaches to literature, and new historicism and so on, and the traditional school, and a big conflict. So you've got this kind of civil war going on, and there's poor Johnny Boy doing this comparative literature topic, which has suddenly gone out of fashion. And it turns out that in any civil war, you have to be on one side or the other.
Yeah.
And I wasn't on either side. So the traditionalist camp interviewed me, or they gave me my viva on the PhD as I submitted it initially. And they made it clear that they weren't very happy. I think they thought I was some kind of newfangled rebel or something, or I don't know, the things I was saying were quite outrageous, or I don't know what. And then I resubmitted it, and this time I got the other side of I got Lisa Jardine and a bunch of I got the new criticism kind of thing. So partly I think I messed up the interview, but also they didn't quite know what to make of me, and they didn't accept it. So twice it was turned down, which is pretty much unheard of. I don't think that would happen today.
Did you go back to Spain after that happened? Is that
I did. I went to the south of Spain, and I really put academia in the bottom drawer, and I just focused on enjoying life, mixing with people, having a good time, doing a bit of teaching here, playing a bit of music here, doing some translating here, and interpreting, just to make ends meet. But basically, just
uh, I think, it's not happy going through something like that, not knowing really what's going to happen. I had some wander a few, let's say 3 or 4 years in a similar thing. It wasn't because of being an advisor dying or something, but I just didn't know what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I look back on those years now, and I'm just very happy knowing all the other people that I know that I had that experience.
Yeah.
That, however, if I had not pivoted out of that, if gotten stuck somehow, it may not have been a happy thing.
Yeah.
And you went back at one point and got qualified in linguistics, a TESOL degree or something.
I took a master's in applied linguistics, thinking that it does look, John, as if you are gravitating more and more to the situation where the only way you could really make some, not just even a modest amount of money is by teaching languages, teaching English and to a certain extent French or Spanish. But
so you qualified there, and then now how did you end up in Japan?
Well, I got a job at a very good language school, which paid not terribly good money, but was a very enjoyable place to work. And it had a sister university, or it had a relationship with a university in Japan.
Yeah.
So there were all these Japanese students who were coming over.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that these students were very often not popular with many of the other teachers, who would find it very difficult. They would ask the Germans a question and the Germans would give an opinion and say things. They'd ask Italians and they couldn't shut the Italians up. But the Japanese, they said, it looked as if they were going to answer, and then they turned to each other and started talking in Japanese. They didn't know how to get a response out of them. Well, it turned out that I was quite good at getting a response out of them and breaking the ice and establishing a friendly relationship where they opened up and they talked about all kinds of things. And very strong encouragement from them. John, you should go to Japan. John, you should go to Japan. So, one thing led to another, and I did come to Japan, to cut a long story short. And
you stayed. And
I stayed, yes.
And you managed to get a position at one of the elite universities here in Japan, in Tokyo. And then you did finish your doctoral degree. And,
yes, when they gave me that sabbatical year, as you know, I wrote that monograph, and then I put the monograph together with several other papers that I'd written, including one on Shakespeare and Catholicism. Sent them all off to Cambridge in a cardboard box, and they interviewed me and gave me the PhD with very little hesitation. They said, "This is
it's very fine. It was earned and not given. It was very fine work, and I like the gumption of it. Never give up, because you didn't have to do that. You could have continued, all the way to retirement and probably.
Yes, but there was pressure for me to get a PhD, and I think there was a feeling that I would do as Peter Milward did and get it through Sophia University. He was an Oxford
undergrad.
He was an Oxford undergrad, but he did his PhD at Sophia. And I just somehow felt, no, it's going to be Cambridge or bust. I want those people to not exactly take it back, but I want them to realize that, I was working on something and I had something to say there.
Yeah.
If I didn't manage to say it to their satisfaction back in those days, it wasn't because there wasn't anything there.
Yeah.
So I took it back all those years later. And even before the interview began, they said, "We just want you to know we really like your stuff." So it was such a different experience from my previous two examinations. I was very relieved, yes.
Yeah, and then a long career at Sophia. And of course, Japan has gone through some growing pains doing what is called, here's Kokusaika, the internationalization. There's been a lot of pressure from all the right kinds of people and for the right kinds of reasons to internationalize, to make sure. And one large part of that is developing your English skills, and sometimes to the disadvantage of people who would like to bring cultural uh, awareness, critical thinking, the things that you need that are cross languages, but also prohibit someone from getting a good grasp of the language they're studying if you don't include them. And so that leads to sometimes a little bit of discontent within departments. You have people who are a little more utilitarian and want to drive forward. And I found that those people usually want to seek power a little bit more than I ever had, and institutional power, kind of small power, and can
Well,
be
we've
a
had
little
it
bit
from the highest political levels that, the humanities are not useful.
yeah.
And what they don't seem to realize is that, of course, the humanities are useful.
Yeah.
I mean, not just in like, it is a sort of some sort of ephemeral treasure or a benefit to the individual and of no benefit to society, but there is research that shows that people who read books commit suicide less than people who don't read books. People who read books get depressed less than people who, they take less time off sick. They contribute more to the workforce. They are better, happier, more positive members of society.
Yeah.
And it really is very, very short-sighted to be saying it should just be functional and utilitarian.
And also, I want to remind, when we say they, we're not talking just about Japanese. I've had this experience.
No. This is a worldwide.
American universities.
Oh, yeah.
It is worldwide. There seems to be a certain. I think in Japan it might feel a little stronger because I think in post-war Japan there was a do or die mentality. I mean, we have to cut out all of the what do you call it, the dressing and the window dressing and all of this stuff. We got to get buildings built. We got to get sewers built. We have to get water in here that's clean and healthy. We got to get engineers who can do all of that and do it effectively. And that still sort of drives things. You can see in Tokyo quite a lot when now it doesn't necessarily have to. And we've had the great benefit of making friends with so many people who are Japanese, who are just spot on with us about the value of cultural education, of learning Shakespeare on so many levels, and so, we often try to make the argument, well, it also helps people in business to know something about Romeo and Juliet. Well, that's a weak argument. You can get through your entire life and make millions and millions of dollars. But then there's so many times when you see people who are successful in business, particularly in the areas of technology and so forth, and they're quite big on humanistic learning. You find out they're readers, and they're well-spoken, they're articulate, and they have sensibility. And they are business leaders, and that's one of the reasons they are. So, but I always come back to public demand. There's no university in the world that if you announced from tomorrow onward, we're no longer teaching Shakespeare, and along with that, Keats and Shelley and everybody else, we're no longer doing that, and no Japanese authors, no French authors, no Italian authors, we're not doing it. It's just not practical. Would that help the university? Would the public image, and I'm talking about John Q, even working class guys and so forth, they go, well, no Shakespeare at Oxford. Well, I just don't know if Oxford's as good as it used to be.
Yeah.
It would probably have a terrible effect. And they get it so cheaply. I'm going on a little bit of a sermon here, my gunpowder sermon, but the public demand is so apparent, and it's great business. It is great business. It can draw in so many people so cheaply, and give you the window dressing and make your place more attractive than the next if you're a university competing for students or whatnot. But we lived through some of those, not culture wars, in fact. That was kind of what was happening at Cambridge when you were coming through, was actually cultural war. That still is out there. And some of the points are still salient that were being brought up back in the day.
Yeah.
And we're really in a competition between, I don't know, the utilitarians and the other people who we are. I don't know what to call us.
Uh,
Some people would call us snowflakes, but I don't view myself as much of a snowflake. I would love to carry this forward and so forth, John. I think that we kind of covered it.
we've
And
covered most of the ground here.
yeah, and I do want to emphasize again, anyone who sees this, to please visit Ano Sensei. It's easy, just put it into YouTube search, would be better than Google, but it would come up on Google, and just look around and shop. There are a few videos in there. If you want to learn something more about Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, you're going to get a great one. And if you want to learn something about better pronunciation of certain English words, and I should say, no, I shouldn't leave that out there. There is no perfect way to pronounce English words. You know, your accent and mine are entirely different.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And
But we just want people to be able to understand. That's all.
Yeah. And yeah, it just, at some point, it gets to be difficult to understand what the word is, and you want to keep it inside that area. So we're not privileging, because there are dialects. I mean, there's a way a person born and raised in France will speak English that you can recognize as a French English accent, and perhaps a Northern European or a Spanish. But
there's nothing wrong with having an accent.
No, it's beautiful.
Everybody's got an accent of some sort.
Everybody's got an accent, and I love it. Sometimes, to hear an Italian speak. I was listening to a podcast, and he was speaking in English, and it was just so lyrical. It brought a lot of beauty to the language that he's bringing from the Italian.
Italian sounds lovely.
But if you want to learn better, a little bit better pronunciation to be understood, practical English that will help you in your job and help you advance in your career, that's available there too. Along with history, I didn't mention before, and I just loved your bit on the pre-William the Conqueror, because
yes,
I knew everything in bits and pieces. I knew all of this, but I realized when I watched it that it wasn't clear in my mind who went where on the map. I knew that there were Picts in Scotland before there were, that Wales. I didn't know that Wales was primarily Breton. I wasn't quite sure about that. And I didn't know about the Indo-European tribes that came in before the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, and then the exact place of the Danish of Daneland, I think it was called in the Old Text. And
some of that is still up for grabs. There's still, from a genetic point of view and various points of view, they're still trying to figure out exactly what the composition of the British.
It's absolutely fascinating. But it's
fascinating. So it's not all cut and dry.
Yeah, but it's where you came from, you very specifically. But if you take that migration, I mean, most of that, came over to the States, and I think more Scottish and Scottish Irish, also what we'd call Ulster, that there were large migrations very early on that were part of my family background. And so it's just an eternal interest to so many people. And even if you're not invested in that, it's just of eternal interest how things developed into a nation state eventually. And so thank you so much for that. I can't wait for your next one, history. And
I'm working on a history one now. I'm working on the Reformation.
Oh, okay. I'm waiting to see that. Well,
and of course, the Shakespeare series has to be added to. It's still very.
Shakespeare's a good key word out there. Well, what I want to do is ask you to stay a little bit afterwards, but before you leave, I wanted to thank you so much again for talking to me today and talking to us, and also for the help that you've given this series.
You're very welcome.
And as we move along, and thank you so much, and my best to you and yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and you.
Bye bye.